Yo, what's going on, YouTube, and welcome back to Goal Line Hockey. It's your boy Kevin Forte, and this is it. This is the end of the 2023-2024 NHL season. Another incredible season, capped off with an incredible Stanley Cup final. The Florida Panthers, congratulations, are your 2024 Stanley Cup champions. We'll be going over that series in today's video, and I mean, the funny thing is, and I said this on our Discord, if you want to check us out on Discord, we've got a community over there. I was talking to them about how, I predicted that the Panthers would win this series, right? Yesterday I made a video talking about how the Panthers would win Game 7. And I also said, before this series even got underway, I said that this was going to be a close series. And that the Florida Panthers would ultimately win this series in 7 games. And back when I said that, yes, in retrospective, technically I'm still correct, but I don't think anybody could have predicted that in a 7-game series, the amount of momentum swings and the emotional turmoil we would see in this series was anything any of us were really expecting. So the Florida Panthers, as we know going into the series, were kind of looked at as the favorite. Obviously there was their fair share of people that picked the Oilers to win, but for the most part, the Panthers were the team going in. Like, unless McDavid literally does everything for this team, which he practically did, this was going to be a championship for the Florida Panthers, but it didn't go as easily as it might have looked. So the first 3 games of the series, the Florida Panthers did what they wanted. They had the Oilers at their mercy. And the Oilers' adjustments after Game 3, in Game 4, it was Game 4 in Edmonton, and at the time, it looked like this was going to be a gentleman's sweep, as they like to call it. And in this sort of scenario, right, the home team, or the team with home ice advantage, wins their 2 games at home. They win the first game on the road. You're basically toast at that point if you're the Oilers. But you know what? If we could at least, for 2 reasons, A, avoid the cup being lifted in our building, and B, having the fans have to sit there and watch another team lift the cup in our building and avoiding the sweep, that's all the motivation in the world. And usually that's how things could go. We saw that back in, I think it was 2021, when Tampa beat Montreal in the final. It was basically a gentleman's sweep as they beat them in 5 games. Well, that was the expectation until Game 5 comes around and the Oilers won Game 5. Okay, so, now this home ice back for the Oilers going into Game 6. Well, they win Game 6. Okay, so now what looked like was going to be a sweep to a gentleman's sweep. Now all of a sudden we're going to a Game 7, and oh shit, the Florida Panthers might actually universally collapse as one of the biggest choke jobs in recent NHL history, but they avoided that, winning Game 7. It was an incredible series, and there was a lot of debate about who would be winning the Conn Smythe Trophy for the best player during the playoffs, and really it came down to 2 players, I think. That is a pretty easy argument, and obviously one being on the side of the Florida Panthers, the eventual Stanley Cup winning team. Sergei Bobrovsky stood on his head in all 4 of the games that the Florida Panthers won. He was the sole contributor to that. And he played at a level that was the difference. And I think the only reason he didn't win it is because during this series he had moments of, oh, this is not good. Oh shit, is Bobrovsky going to blow it? And are we even going to see the Panthers start Bobrovsky in Game 7? That's how close things got once we got to Game 7. And I think that's ultimately why they ended up going with the Oilers' best player during their playoffs, which was Connor McDavid. And rightfully so. I think Connor McDavid had an incredible playoffs this year. He rightfully so deserved to win the Conn Smythe. I don't think there's much of a debate about that, to the dismay of Panthers fans in the stadium. But I don't think it was kind of a lose-lose, and that's why I don't really like when they do that, because Connor McDavid didn't even go out to receive the Conn Smythe, because ultimately, who cares about the Conn Smythe? We didn't win the Stanley Cup. You don't grow up, living the dream of playing in the National Hockey League or playing on NHL, winning the Conn Smythe trophy. No. You want to have the C on your jersey, being the first guy with the commissioner of the NHL telling you to come over to lift the Stanley Cup. That's what you're ultimately looking for. That's the ultimate goal. And Connor McDavid didn't get that. So I totally understand that. Anybody that's going to give, which I'm sure they will, bitches and gripes about him not going to get the trophy, I totally get that. Now, from the Panthers' perspective, this is a situation where the Panthers also, again, I don't think this is a team that is more of a team game. And I said that before Game 7 was ultimately the team that was going to win this series was the team that had the team mentality. And not to say that the Oilers didn't, but let's be honest, this is the Connor McDavid show. And that's how it's always been since McDavid stepped into Edmonton. And the reality is, in a Game 7 situation where the Panthers could maybe key in on a guy like Draisaitl or McDavid, which they did extraordinarily well, that was the difference. And the Panthers had just enough clutch scoring at just the right time. That ended up being the ultimate difference. And, really the difference from what we saw in Games 4, 5, and 6, and the difference for Game 7 was when the Oilers tied the game, there wasn't panic from the Florida Panthers. And that was something we didn't see from the Panthers for those games that they lost. And that was really a moment of growth during this series for the Florida Panthers that ultimately ended up being the difference. I really want to give a shout out to a couple of players that are going to be getting a Stanley Cup victory ring. Obviously out in the stands, and probably not the way he would have liked to have gotten a Stanley Cup. But I look at a guy like Roberto Luongo. He's a guy that spent so much time in the National Hockey League. All the turmoil he dealt with leaving Florida the first time, going to Vancouver. We know how things went with his career in Vancouver. Ultimately going back to end his career with the Florida Panthers. And ultimately now being in an upper management role. I'm really happy to see Luongo there and doing well. The other thing that you need to look at is some of the other players, the veterans, right? Kyle Oposo. I remember his time with the Islanders, drafted by the New York Islanders. He's one of those guys that always will stick with me as a player that I really genuinely enjoyed watching. And, he was on the other side of some of the Florida Panthers series early on in the years of the Panthers, finally getting back to the Stanley Cup playoffs, playing the New York Islanders, which Oposo was on. So kind of coming full circle on that one. Obviously, guys like Sam Bennett, Sam Reinhart, Alexander Barkov. Who would have thought when the Panthers drafted him that ultimately he would be getting the nod from Gary Bettman to come lift the Stanley Cup? A lot of people at the time were questioning if that was the right move by the Panthers. At the time, it seemed like kind of a weird pick. Some Finnish kid that we're not really sure, people know he's good, but just how good is he? And there was other players on the board that they could have gone after from North America that had been scouted more and were more hyped. Looking back, that was an easy one for the Florida Panthers, and they look like geniuses with what they did with that pick. There was a lot of questioning at the time with Sergei Bobrovsky coming into the fold. There was possibility of maybe even Panarin and Bobrovsky coming as a package to Florida. There was a lot of things going on with Bobrovsky, maybe going to the Islanders at one point, going to a couple of different locations. He ultimately signs with the Panthers. His first season did not go well at all. There was questions of would the Panthers even buy out that contract. Yes, that contract is still large, but you know what? When you win a Stanley Cup, none of that really matters anymore. The Panthers, I would say, feel pretty good about that decision looking back now. And, it's one of those things where hindsight 2024, things look different than they did even just 2 years ago from that signing. And that's why teams that maybe are in a situation that maybe aren't the best, you have to remember, just like that, things can change. I remember 3 years ago, I got the Panthers winning the President's Trophy shirt. And, what was that, 2021, I think. 2022. 2022, they won the President's Trophy, and they had the choke job. They lost in the first round, and they had been embarrassed. It was an embarrassing time for the Florida Panthers. They had won the President's Trophy, and the curse had struck them. And it looked like that was maybe we were never going to see that from the Panthers again. Because at that point, the Panthers were not the team that was constantly at the upper echelon of the NHL. They were a team that makes the playoffs every once in a while, and the fans get excited and throw rats on the ice, but they were never taken seriously. The next season, they would take on the Boston Bruins. We know the story of that. They were down, I think, 3-1 in that series to the Bruins, who at the time were kind of seen as a cup favorite, right? Winning the President's Trophy themselves in 2023. They were the team to beat. And the Florida Panthers would ultimately come all the way back, sending that game to a Game 7 in Boston. And despite the circumstance in that game, they shocked the hockey world, winning that series in overtime in Boston in Game 7. And that first round series ultimately propelled them to the final, where they were outmatched by the Vegas Golden Knights. And they had to watch Mark Stone and Jonathan Marchessault and some of the other players there on the Vegas Golden Knights lifting the Stanley Cup. And I think that was the motivation that really ultimately was the difference for the Panthers going into this year's playoffs. This has been their goal since Game 7 of last year for the Florida Panthers. Not Game 7, but since the end of last season, when Vegas lifted the cup. They had that extra little bit of hurt, and I think that extra little bit of hurt propelled them to ultimately getting to their goal this year. And, this is a team that you see the progression of where they've come from. You look at, kind of seen as the little baby brother to the Tampa Bay Lightning the last couple years. They basically handled them in the first round. They take on the Boston Bruins, looking to get revenge from what happened last year in their run for the playoffs. They beat them as well. The New York Rangers, who were kind of seen as the top team in the Eastern Conference, the President's Trophy winning team, they took care of them and dispatched them as well. And ultimately, the Edmonton Oilers, who kind of in their own right, really, some people expected them to be here. A lot of people didn't expect them to be here. So there was just a lot of things for the Florida Panthers that could have easily gone wrong, and a lot of hurdles they had to overcome. But ultimately, they did what they wanted to do. They set their goal. They set that they knew they could be a team that could win a Stanley Cup ever since last year, and they were able to do it this year. And the last thing I'm going to bring up today, and this is more of a kind of an indication of the franchise. I've seen a lot of people talking about, specifically in Florida, just how much this means to them. As an Islander fan, I can relate to this in the sense as well as always talk about your team relocating to Quebec City, to Kansas City, to this, to that. Well, that talk is probably put to bed. The Florida Panthers seem like they're going to be staying in Sunrise, Florida for the very foreseeable future, which is a great thing. But let's be honest, there's been a lot of mockery for the fan base. There's not a high enough attendance. They don't bring in as much money as other teams around the National Hockey League. And there was a lot of questioning if they could potentially be moving. And I think everything we've seen, especially just as soon as this week with the Arizona Coyotes, just how close the Florida Panthers were to being where the Coyotes franchise is right now. And I think that this is a really good time for Panthers fans to, yes, of course, enjoy and probably have some boat tailgating parties and things like that this summer, but to also remember just how close this franchise was to being folded or moved. It's a good retrospective to see just how far this team has come. As the team that was the doormat of the National Hockey League, continually getting first and second and fifth overall picks, and everything that this team has been through. They've gone through a lot down there, and for anybody to sit there and say the non-traditional hockey market winning a Stanley Cup isn't good for the game and this and that, you're so wrong. And there's so many different ways to describe that, and maybe I'll make an entire video about that this summer. But this is good for the sport of hockey. It's good to see teams like Tampa and Florida doing well. Maybe not the expense of the New York teams, which obviously I don't like in a sense, but in overall, I think this is a good thing for the sport. And for the Florida Panthers, congratulations on winning your first Stanley Cup. I think it's really good to see teams winning their first Stanley Cup. We've seen teams like Washington, St. Louis, Vegas, and now, most recently, the Florida Panthers winning their first championship. Something to give that fan base hope that they can win, that there is hope, and there's a little bit of parity in the National Hockey League, which I think is a really good thing. Of course, at the end of today's video, like I always do for these videos, thank you all for watching these videos. I know the last couple weeks have been really tough. I'll probably, hopefully explain that at some point, maybe at the end of this year. But a lot of stuff has been going on. This channel has been a little bit more dormant during the end of the playoffs than I would have liked. But unfortunately, life happens, life gets in the way. But I appreciate all of you sticking around, continuing to comment, watching my old videos. I do see that, and it really means a lot. So thank you all. Thank you for another incredible season. I'm going to continue to make content throughout the summer as much as I can, which may not be as much as we're accustomed to, but as much as I can. And of course, if maybe I'll see you in the fall. If you're one of those people that maybe wants a break during the summer, totally understand. I'll be back in the fall. As always, guys, thank you so much for watching this video once again. Thank you so much for just continuing the support throughout the summer. And again, thank you to the Florida Panthers and their fans. You guys have been awesome. It's been an incredible season. Guys, I'll talk to you again soon, and I'll see you again next season. Peace out.